This is the third part of our lesson on exploring the equation of a line. So we just finished doing an investigation where we looked at some graphs and we looked at some equations and we tried to make a connection between the numbers in the equation and what we were seeing on the graph. So one of the things that I noticed that was fairly easy to pick out was this number at the end that doesn't have a variable next to it. And that was where our line was crossing the y-axis. And that has a name. It is called the y-intercept. So the y-intercept is where it crosses, we're going to say where the line crosses the y-axis. Now, why is it called B? Who knows? I did try to do a little research to figure that one out. And the very first time somebody used the letter B in written work was a really long time ago. And they thought that they were using B because they used A for the x-intercept and B for the y-intercept, and that they're just in alphabetical order. So it's a weird letter choice for a y-intercept, but you couldn't use Y because that stands for the Y part of the coordinate. So that was just the letter that they picked. Now, we have seen the y-intercept before, back in Unit 2, and back then it was also called the initial value. Okay, now the M. The M, when we looked at our investigation, was the roadmap for how we would get from one point to the next. And this point is called the slope. And the slope tells me how to get to the next point. It's telling me how steep my line is, how high or low we're going each time, how far over we're moving each time. It really is there to tell me how to get from, say, the y-intercept to the next point that I want to get to. Now, slope is up and down first, and then side to side second. That is called sometimes rise over run. Rise being the up and down part, and then run being the side to side part. Rise is up and down, that's the y value. So it's also called delta y, or the change in y, divided by delta x, which is our change in x. And this formula we have seen before. We saw that formula in unit number 2. And this is also called rate of change. So when you have an equation, the slope or the rate of change is always with the variable, because it's the thing, it tells me how many times am I moving up and over, right? We don't do it just once, we do it multiple times. And then our B is the one that's by itself. It is our y-intercept, and it tells us where our graph is going to cross the y-axis, and it's also known as the initial value. So there are 3 equations. We're going to take a look, and we're going to see if we can pull out of the equation which one is the slope and which one is the y-intercept. So it says state the slope and y-intercept of each, and we have y equals 5 over 7x minus 9. So you can write out the word slope and y-intercept, or we can use the short forms m and b. It's entirely up to you. I think I'm going to write m and b just because it's a little less writing. So the slope should always be next to the x. So in this case, that would be 5 over 7. And the b should always be the part that's not next to the x, which is not just 9, but negative 9. If I look at the next one, I have y equals 3 minus 6x. So I'm going to write down my slope, or m, and my y-intercept, or b. So the slope should always be next to the x. That means the 6 is next to the x. And it's not just a 6, it's a negative 6. So my slope is negative 6. And then my y-intercept is the other number, which is 3. Now our last example, I have y equals 9x. So if I'm taking a look at y equals 9x, I notice that it doesn't have two parts, it only has one part, but it does have the part next to the x, which means that that 9 is actually the slope because it's next to the x. Now what about the y-intercept? Well, there isn't anything else here. So there is an invisible 0 because there's nothing there, which means the y-intercept of this would actually be 0. Okay, you can join me in the next part of the video to look at the next question.